He smelled the cheap whiskey on the judge's breath and the scent of old parchment before the words even left the man's mouth. And that was the thing about the law in the territory. It always smelled of decay long before it reached the ears of the accused. Silas Thorne stood in the center of that small adobe courtroom with his hands shackled and his heart as heavy as a lead bullet, knowing that the only reason he was still breathing was because he had something the court needed. The horse scout was tied outside, and Silas could hear the restless stomp of the animal's hooves against the sun-baked earth, as if the beast understood that the contract being discussed inside was a violation of the open sky they both loved. The judge was a man named Miller, a man whose eyes were as cold as the bottom of a dry well, and he offered Silas a choice that was no choice at all. He could hang by sunset, or he could marry Clara Vane and take her to the Northern Pass to claim a piece of land that the railroad agents were already circling like vultures over a dying steer. Silas looked at the girl sitting in the corner, her face hidden by a bonnet and her hands folded in her lap like a broken bird. And he ran the calculation in his mind, thinking that a silent wife was a small price to pay for a pardon and a chance to ride away from the gallows. He underestimated the weight of that ring before it ever touched his finger, and he certainly did not see the sharp edge of the blade hidden beneath the lace of her sleeves. And you know what really gets me? Every time I look back at the records of this particular betrayal, is not the cruelty of the judge, but the absolute arrogance of Silas Thorne. He sat there with his spurs clicking against the floor, thinking he was the one in control because he was the one with the reputation for a fast draw and a cold heart. He saw Clara as a piece of baggage to be carried across the desert, a fragile thing that would need his protection and his permission to exist. And I can never get past the detail of how he smiled when he signed the marriage license. He thought he was cheating death, but he was really just signing his own name to a ledger that had already been settled in blood long before he ever walked into that room. Hey, real quick, if you are enjoying this deep dive into the shadows of the frontier, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next trail we travel together. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from today, because I love seeing how far these stories of ruin and redemption can reach. Now back to that desert road where the sun was starting to burn the pretense away, and where Silas Thorne was about to learn that silence is not always a sign of weakness. The ride north was quiet, and the only sound was the rhythmic creak of the leather saddles and the dry whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Silas rode ahead on scout, keeping his eyes on the horizon and his hand near the grip of his Colt, treating Clara as if she were a shadow that he could ignore until the sun went down. She followed him on a gray mare, her posture stiff and her voice non-existent, and for 3 days, Silas believed he had made the easiest deal of his life. He told himself that once they reached the Northern Pass, he would leave her with the land and the paperwork and vanish into the mountains of Colorado where the law could not find him. He did not notice the way she watched him when he was sleeping, and he did not see her fingers moving with the precision of a card, sharp as she inspected the chambers of his spare revolver while he was watering the horses at the creek. He assumed she was afraid of the dark and the wolves, but the truth was that she was just waiting for the right moment to show him that she had been the one hunting him all along. The betrayal came on the 4th night at the edge of a jagged canyon where the moon was high and the air was cold enough to crack stone. They had made camp near a small spring, and Silas was sitting by the fire cleaning the grit from his boots, thinking about the gold he would make once he was free of the judge and the girl. Clara walked over to him, and for the first time, she removed her bonnet, revealing eyes that were not full of fear, but of a lethal and focused intelligence that made Silas reach for his gun before he even knew why. He was too slow, not because his hand had failed him, but because the woman he had dismissed as a victim had already sabotaged every weapon he owned. When he pulled the trigger of his Colt, all he heard was the hollow click of a firing pin hitting a chamber filled with sand and lead shot that had been glued in place with resin. He looked up at her and saw the small silver derringer in her hand, a weapon he had mocked when he first saw it in the judge's office, and he realized that the marriage had not been a way to save his life, but a way to ensure he was the only one left in the yard when the posse arrived. Clara spoke then, and her voice was as smooth as silk and as sharp as a razor, telling him that she was not the judge's daughter, but his business partner, and that Silas Thorne was the perfect man to take the fall for the murder of the railroad agents in Mill Haven. She explained that the land in the northern pass was already sold, and the only thing missing was a dead gunslinger and a grieving widow to collect the insurance and the silence of the territory. Silas felt the cold realization sink into his gut like a gut shot from a buffalo rifle, as he understood that every step of the journey had been a choreographed move in a game he did not even know he was playing. He had underestimated her because he could not imagine a woman with the same capacity for violence as himself, and that pride was the noose that was now tightening around his neck. She did not shoot him then. She simply whistled, and 3 riders emerged from the shadows of the canyon, including the judge's own foreman, and Silas knew that he had been led into a trap that had no exit. The ruin of Silas Thorne was not a quick affair, but a slow and agonizing descent into a nightmare, where he was stripped of his horse, his guns, and his dignity, before being left tied to a post in the center of a burning line shack. Clara stood by the door, watching the flames take hold of the dry timber, her face illuminated by the orange glow of the fire, and she told him that the world would remember him as the man who kidnapped a judge's daughter and died in a drunken rage. Silas screamed, but the only answer he got was the roar of the fire and the receding sound of horses' hooves as the woman he had subestimated rode away into the night with his gold and his reputation. He died in that shack, not as a legend of the frontier, but as a footnote in a crooked ledger, a man who had survived 100 gunfights only to be outplayed by the silence of a bride he thought he owned. It is a story that reminds us that the most dangerous thing in the Old West was never the man with the loudest gun, but the person with the quietest plan. I think about Silas Thorne sometimes, and the way he must have looked at those flames, realizing that his entire life had been a series of errors that led to that one final mistake. He had forgotten that the frontier does not care about your ego or your past. It only cares about who is left standing when the smoke clears. And that night, it was the bride that Silas had thought was nothing more than a ghost. This whole series has been about the hidden truths of the West and the way the law was often just a mask for the lawless. And Silas Thorne's ruin is the clearest example of what happens when you believe your own myth. Scout was found weeks later, wandering near the border, still saddled and waiting for a master who was never coming back. A silent witness to a betrayal that the history books would never record. Thank you for staying with me on this dark road, and remember that out here on the edge of the world, the person you subestimate is usually the one who will bury you. The high country in the winter is a place where secrets are frozen in time, and where the wind whispers the names of the men who were lost to the greed of others. Silas Thorne was just one more name added to the list of the forgotten, but his story stays with me because it shows the true power of the undercurrents that moved the territory. Whether it is a banker with a ledger or a bride with a derringer. The real rulers of the frontier were the ones who knew how to wait and how to strike when the light was low. Scout eventually found a new home with a young rancher who did not know his history, and the horse lived out his days in the peace of the valley, far away from the fire and the blood of the canyon. If you have been here since the start of this series, you know that the gunslinger with no name is still out there somewhere watching the smoke rise and waiting for the next secret to be revealed. The full journey starts at episode 1 with the story of Dust Creek and the 5 guns at noon. And every step since then has been leading us deeper into the heart of the Old West. As the sun sets over the mesas and the shadows grow long, I want to thank you for being a part of this community and for helping to keep these stories alive in a world that often forgets the weight of the past. Leave your country in the comments and let me know which part of Silas Thorne's downfall resonated with you the most, because your feedback is the fuel that keeps this campfire burning. I will see you on the next road where the guns are always loaded, and the truth is, the only thing that survives the long night of the frontier. The road ahead is winding, and the secrets are deep, but as long as we have the courage to look at the shadows, we will never be truly lost in the dust of history. Be safe, be free, and never forget that a contract signed in fear is a debt that will always be called in with interest. Adios for now, and I will meet you at the next ridge where the smoke is still rising. Silas Thorne spent his final moments thinking about the receipts he had never kept and the words he had never said, realizing too late that the woman beside him was the mirror he had refused to look into. He saw her face one last time in the embers of the shack, a vision of a predator who had finally found her prey, and he knew that his ruin was the only honest outcome for a man who had built his life on the subestimation of others. The fire eventually died down, leaving nothing but ash and bone in the silence of the canyon, and the desert reclaimed the space as if he had never been there at all. The judge in Mill Haven continued his work for another decade before he was caught in a different scandal, but Clara Vane was never seen again, having vanished into the fog of the Northern Territories with a new name and a fortune in railroad gold. The receipts of the frontier are often written in the lives of the people who thought they were the ones holding the pen, and Silas Thorne was just the ink that dried in the sun. Looking back at the path we have traveled through these stories, I am reminded that the West was not just a place of mountains and plains, but a place of the human spirit pushed to its absolute limit. Silas Thorne failed because he forgot that everyone in the territory was fighting for their own survival, and that some were just better at hiding their teeth than others. The next time you see a quiet road or an abandoned shack in the high country, think of the gunslinger who accepted a forced marriage and paid the ultimate price for his arrogance. The wind will continue to blow and the dust will continue to settle, but the echoes of the betrayal at the canyon will remain as a warning to anyone who thinks they can own another person's destiny. This has been a tale of iron and ash, and I hope it stays with you as you navigate your own trails through the modern wilderness. The journey of the gunslinger is far from over, and there are many more valleys to explore and many more legends to uncover before the last light fades from the horizon. Thank you for your time and your attention, and for being the reason I continue to dig through the dust of the past to find these jewels of storytelling. God bless, and may your own path be free of the traps that Silas Thorne found in the silence of his bride. Keep your eyes on the stars and your heart on the truth, and I will see you when the dust settles on the next chapter of our journey together. Goodbye for now, and safe travels to everyone who follows the trail of the Old West. Silas Thorne is gone, but the lesson he learned in the fire lives on in the wind that blows across the canyon, reminding us all that we are only as strong as the people we choose to trust. The desert wind is a lonely thing when it has no one left to talk to, and the canyon is a deep grave for a man who didn't know how to listen. The story of the bride and the gunslinger is just one more road in a long map of pain and power, and I am glad I could share it with you tonight. As you close this video, remember that the real power of the West was not in the holster, but in the mind of the person who knew how to use it. Adios. Silas Thorne had a cold draw, but Clara Vane had a cold mind. And in the end, the mind always beats the hand when the stakes are as high as a life in the territory. The high plains are calling, and I must answer, so I will see you on the next ridge where the guns are always loaded, and the truth is the only thing that remains after the smoke has cleared away into the blue sky. Be safe and keep your powder dry. Adios. The story of the gunslinger who accepted a forced marriage and paid dearly will be told in the saloons of the territory for 100 years as a reminder that the law of the land is often different from the law of the heart. Silas Thorne thought he was a predator, but he was just a pawn in a game that was much larger than his own survival. The ruin he found was the result of a lifetime of ignoring the small details and the quiet voices, and it is a fate that awaits anyone who forgets that the most dangerous weapon is the one you do not see coming. Clara Vane was the ghost he couldn't catch, and the storm he couldn't ride, and her legacy is written in the gold she took and the bodies she left behind. Thank you for listening to this chronicle of the frontier, and I hope it gives you something to think about. The next time you are faced with a choice between the easy path and the honest one. God bless and safe travels to all who wander the high country in search of the truth. Adios and goodbye to the legends of the Old West. The final embers of the line shack flickered out in the early morning light, leaving nothing but a black scar on the face of the canyon, as a monument to the man who underestimated his bride. Silas Thorne was a gunslinger with no future because he had spent his past believing that the world was as simple as a target and a trigger, but Clara Vane had shown him that the world was as complex as a spider web. She was the architect of his ruin and the narrator of his end, and her story is the one that truly matters in the history of the territory. I will see you on the next road where the shadows are deep and the stories are long, and the truth is the only thing that survives the fire. Thank you for being part of this series, and I look forward to our next meeting in the high hills of the frontier. Goodbye for now, and adios to the ghosts of the High Sierra. Silas Thorne is gone, but the road goes on forever, and I hope you stay with me until the very end. Adios.